welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going to have to take a deep breath because we are wading into some profoundly difficult source material.
We are. We're focusing on one of the most chilling husband and wife criminal partnerships in American history, the case of Alvin and Judith Neelley.
And this is a really crucial deep dive
Yeah.
because it forces us to confront some very uncomfortable concepts.
Absolutely. It's not just about criminal brutality, but about extreme, protracted psychological control.
So our mission today is to try and move beyond the sensational headlines, right? We want to unpack the complex questions these sources raise.
Exactly. Questions about culpability, coercion, and how the justice system is supposed to deal with a perpetrator who is also undeniably a victim.
Okay, so if we're going to understand the crimes, we have to start with the architect of the violence. The sources on Alvin Lee Neelley are, well, they're very clear.
They are. He was an established career criminal, a volatile predator, long before he even met Judith.
The patterns were already there.
Oh, absolutely. The patterns were set very early. Alvin's history, and this is years before the most notorious crimes, it was already marked by assault, by kidnapping, sexual abuse.
He sounds like he was driven by something more than just, greed or opportunity.
It was sadism, a profound sadism. The sources say he was driven by an almost pathological need for power over others. For him, violence wasn't just a means to an end. It was how he affirmed himself.
And that search for total domination for someone he could completely control led him directly to Judith Ann Brown.
And her early life is just a portrait of immense instability and vulnerability.
When you look at the timeline, it's toxic from the very beginning.
It's truly shocking. Alvin was more than a decade older than Judith, and they first met when she was only 10 years old. 10. By age 14, they were married. I mean, this is a classic textbook grooming scenario.
He systematically isolated her, didn't he?
Completely. Cut her off from any stabilizing influences and immediately subjected her to what the records describe as years of just relentless physical, sexual, and psychological abuse.
So this was less a marriage and more like a prison he constructed just for her.
That's a good way to put it. The sources suggest he didn't just physically control her, he meticulously dismantled her identity.
So she could only function as an extension of his will.
That's the critical distinction right there. Alvin found someone he could, quote, dominate completely. And through that sustained, systematic violence, he transformed her from a deeply traumatized victim into an active participant in his crimes.
That dynamic is the whole key to this case.
It is.
So you've brought up this concept, coercive control. It's the foundational tool Alvin used. For listeners who might have heard the term, what are the core mechanisms we're talking about here?
Well, coercive control is so much more sophisticated than just, intermittent physical violence. It's an enduring pattern of behavior.
And it's designed to make the victim completely dependent.
And compliant. Exactly. In the Neelley marriage, the sources detail specific methods. We're talking intense monitoring, isolation from friends and family, economic deprivation.
Constant degradation.
Constant degradation that just shattered Judith's self-worth. He didn't just tell her what to do. He dictated her beliefs, her perceptions of reality, and ultimately her entire sense of morality.
So it wasn't just controlling where she was, but what she was thinking, her mind.
Yes. And this is where the ideological component becomes so chillingly effective.
The religious aspect.
The religious aspect, which often gets overlooked, Alvin used what the sources call twisted religious interpretations to justify his violence.
So he could reinforce his absolute divinely sanctioned authority over her.
Precisely. If he committed a violent act, he'd frame it in some warped religious context. This made her participation, or even just her obedience, seem like a moral or even a necessary act. It's an inescapable psychological justification for pure sadism.
Wow. And that weaponization of ideology combined with the constant abuse, it must have been devastatingly effective.
It was. And that leads us directly to the concept of trauma bonding.
Okay.
When you're subjected to constant violence, but it's interspersed with these moments of, let's say, kindness or protection, even if that protection is from a world he made up.
It creates this intense emotional dependency.
That's it. Judith got trapped in a cycle where she saw Alvin not just as her abuser, but also at the same time as her protector and master.
So it's the trauma bond.
That is the trauma bond. And that deeply toxic dependency was the necessary infrastructure for the criminal spree that followed.
So that dynamic is set. A master predator.
Yeah.
And this deeply controlled, traumatized dependent. And this culminates in the crime that defines them. the 1978 kidnapping and murder of 13-year-old Lisa Ann Millican.
This was the crime that brought them to national attention, and the details, they reveal the true depth of their partnership. Lisa Millican was abducted while hitchhiking.
And crucially, she wasn't killed immediately.
No. They held her captive for several agonizing days, subjecting her to repeated, prolonged abuse.
And that duration, the length of the captivity, is so key, isn't it? It moves it beyond a spontaneous crime into something sustained.
Absolutely. It becomes central to the whole legal debate that follows.
Right, because when the case went to trial, the central conflict was all about Judith's role during that time.
It was. While she later claimed she was only following Alvin's direct orders, under duress,
The testimony said otherwise.
the court testimony presented evidence that she actively participated in the torture of Lisa. This wasn't passive compliance. This suggested a real engagement with the violence before Lisa was ultimately murdered by gunshot.
And the Millican murder, as horrific as it was, the sources point out it was just one part of a much broader pattern of violence.
That's right. The investigation suggested the Neelleys were responsible for a frightening pattern of crimes across state lines. Kidnappings, sexual assaults, intense torture.
And possible additional murders.
Yes. The MO was consistent: vulnerable victims, extreme violence, and this partnership dynamic where Alvin commanded and Judith
Participated.
actively.
So what finally brought them down? How did law enforcement connect them?
Initially, it was witness statements about a vehicle and some inconsistencies in their movements. But the case was really cemented when Judith, during the investigation, provided these incredibly detailed confessions.
And those confessions became the core evidence.
They became crucial, legally binding evidence against both herself and Alvin.
Which brings us to the trial. And this is something that decades later still raises these profound moral and legal questions.
It's deeply uncomfortable.
So how did the prosecution frame Judith's role, given her extensive history of abuse?
The prosecution was uncompromising. They had her confessions. They had the evidence of her participation. Their argument was that, look, while her background was tragic, she wasn't just a helpless bystander.
They argued she was an active and willing participant.
Exactly. That her capacity for criminal action had transcended her victim status.
But on the other side, the defense had this harrowing timeline we talked about. Abuse at 10, marriage at 14, years of this control.
And they focused on that relentlessly. Her age at the time of the crime, she was still very young, and the systemic abuse. The core of their argument was duress.
Suggesting she was so completely dominated, psychologically and physically, that she was just acting out of fear for her own life.
That her actions were essentially involuntary. That Alvin's control made any kind of resistance impossible.
And the justice system seemed to distinguish between them pretty early on. What happened to Alvin?
Alvin Neelley. Well, he was consistently viewed by everyone, the public and the court, as the undisputed primary instigator and a remorseless predator.
He was sentenced to death.
He was, and he was executed by electric chair in Alabama in 1983. For him, the question of culpability was settled quickly and decisively.
But Judith, her outcome is where this case just explodes into controversy and creates this lasting legal legacy.
It really does. She was also sentenced to death initially, but then her sentence was commuted.
And that commutation to life imprisonment sparked immediate public and legal outcry.
Huge outcry. The judge cited two main factors: her extreme youth at the time of the crimes and the documented extensive abuse she suffered. The court was essentially prioritizing the mitigating circumstances.
But the public outrage, especially from Lisa Millican's family, was enormous. And this is where the state of Alabama took this extraordinary, really rare legal step.
It was fascinating and unprecedented. The commutation caused such a profound sense of injustice that the state legislature of Alabama stepped in. They passed specific retroactive legislation.
Designed solely to prevent her from ever getting parole.
Exactly. Specifically, Judith Neelley. It was an exceptionally rare political and legal move, basically hardening her life sentence into one without any possibility of release no matter what.
That one legal move just speaks volumes about the societal conflict here, doesn't it?
It does. It shows the courts just struggling to reconcile the legal need for accountability with the psychological reality of trauma and coercion.
So let's shift to that, the psychological analysis. Why is the Neelley case still a staple in criminal psychology studies today?
Because it perfectly illustrates these boundary-breaking concepts we've talked about. Coercive control, trauma bonding, learned helplessness.
Right.
Researchers use it to distinguish between shared psychopathy, where both partners are equally violent, and a dominant submissive partnership, which is what the Neelleys were. Alvin was the clear psychopath. Judith's pathology was induced through trauma.
But you mentioned earlier that the truth about her culpability is likely somewhere in between total duress and willing participation. And that ambiguity is so unsatisfying.
And that dissatisfaction is exactly why we have to dwell on the nuance. The sources suggest she was driven by learned helplessness, this psychological state where you just stop trying to escape abuse because past attempts only led to worse pain.
But some of the court findings pointed to something else.
They did. They suggested moments where her actions during the captivity seemed to exceed what was strictly necessary for compliance, moments that could be seen as independent cruelty.
So how is that possible? If the control was absolute, how could she exhibit independent cruelty?
That is the core debate. It's theorized that prolonged trauma bonding can lead to the absorption of the abuser's twisted ideology. She may have internalized Alvin's sadism.
So she saw dehumanizing the victim as necessary for her own survival within their unit.
It's possible. She was a victim who, under this extreme duress, became a profoundly dangerous offender. And the court had to acknowledge both of those realities at the same time.
So the lasting impact of this deep dive is that the Neelley case really acts as a framework for these uncomfortable questions we're still grappling with today.
Indeed. First, how much does a victim's history of abuse mitigate their responsibility when they commit violent crimes?
Second, can psychological coercion, even as extreme as this, fully excuse participation in murder?
Especially when the actions are prolonged. And finally, and this is the big one, where does the justice system draw that line between empathy for suffering and absolute accountability for crimes?
These are not questions with easy answers.
No, they're not.
And it seems like that complex moral puzzle ensures her case will stay active and debated. Judith Neelley is still incarcerated, serving that life sentence without parole, and continues to unsuccessfully challenge her sentence.
The Neelley case just utterly challenged any simple black and white narrative. It exposed how a dynamic built on extreme manipulation can just shatter the lines between victim and perpetrator,
Creating outcomes that defy any simple moral or legal box you try to put them in. It's a haunting case study in the consequences of control.
It is.
But the insight we take away from this deep dive, from the psychological analysis of this terrible partnership, it offers a truly grim final thought for you to consider.
That's right. The true horror story of Alvin and Judith Neelley serves as a chilling reminder that sometimes the most terrifying monsters aren't born into the world. They're systematically and meticulously created through abuse, control, and absolute domination.
And that is a fact that challenges how we view both crime and human responsibility.